Hi guys, today we're going to talk about the protests in Zimbabwe and the origins of the Zimbabwe crisis. Zimbabwe is in crisis. In response to anti-corruption protests, the government of President Emmerson Mnangagwa has unleashed a brutal crackdown, including kidnapping and torturing protesters. This occurs against the backdrop of a strike by doctors and nurses in the middle of a pandemic. This in a country that is crippled by coronavirus while already suffering from a 20-year economic depression. What's going on in Zimbabwe and how did we get here? Just before we start, don't forget to subscribe for more political analysis videos every week and hit that bell notification while you're at it. Many people have speculated about whether coronavirus restrictions could be used to crack down on civil liberties. In Zimbabwe, it has happened. In July, award-winning journalist Hopewell Chinono exposed corruption. Zimbabwe's Minister of Health, Obadiah Moyo, had illegally awarded a $20 million contract for PPE and coronavirus testing kits at inflated prices. The minister was fired and arrested, but not soon after, Hopewell Chinono was also arrested for inciting violence. In response, opposition groups called for mass protests against corruption to take place on July 31st. Days before the protests were set to take place, the government suddenly expanded the coronavirus lockdown and declared all protests illegal and in violation of coronavirus measures and imposed a curfew. Nevertheless, the protests went ahead anyway, and in response, the government unleashed a brutal crackdown. 19 people were kidnapped and thousands beaten and tortured by the police and the military. Opposition activists were forced to go into hiding, and the government labeled the protesters and opposition groups as terrorists sponsored by America. It is this brutal response to peaceful protesters that has led to the rise of the hashtag #Zimbabweanlivesmatter. Now, all this has happened against the backdrop of a deeper political, economic, and healthcare crisis. In May, there were also protests against the government's inadequate response to the coronavirus. The government introduced a coronavirus lockdown, but with almost no economic relief measures. Zimbabwe's health infrastructure is also on the brink of collapse. 20 years of economic depression have crippled the country's once great healthcare system. The government was totally ill-equipped. Nurses were running around with no PPE. Doctors and nurses were massively underpaid, and so they went on strike in the middle of a pandemic. Because for them, they are essentially being sent into a death zone. And one of the consequences of this was that 7 babies were stillborn in one night in a hospital because there was no one to assist with the birth. And it is with this rhetoric and this kind of response to peaceful protests that President Mnangagwa has returned to the same authoritarian tactics of his predecessor, Robert Mugabe. Now, for those of you who don't know, until 2017, Zimbabwe had been ruled for 37 years by Robert Mugabe and his ZANU-PF party, the Zimbabwe African National Union Patriotic Front, the party that liberated Zimbabwe from British colonial rule. By 2017, the country was in dire straits economically. An internal power struggle within the ZANU-PF party led to a military coup that brought Emmerson Mnangagwa, who was Mugabe's right-hand man, to power. This coup was initially met with celebrations, and Mnangagwa promised a so-called new dispensation. This would entail economic reform to solve the economic crisis.
Zimbabwe is open for business.
And opening up of the political space. And initially, there was an increase in freedom of speech, with comedians like Comrade Fatso being able to make fun of the president, something unthinkable in the past. Elections were scheduled for July 2018, and the opposition party, the Movement for Democratic Change, or MDC, was allowed to campaign relatively freely and peacefully. You see, Zimbabwe has always had elections, but since the year 2000, those elections have been rigged, and state-sponsored violence has been used to terrorize opposition activists. So this represented a positive change. But of course, there were still structural biases in the electoral system and milder tactics, like vote buying, that hampered the opposition. Now, before the results were announced, there were delays and people grew suspicious that this would be another rigged election. Opposition leader Nelson Chamisa prematurely tweeted that he had won the election, and so protesters marched onto the streets, and they were met with violence by the army. 6 people were shot dead and 35 were injured. The army, which people had celebrated just months before for overthrowing Mugabe, was now the enemy again. And so when the results came in, Emmerson Mnangagwa had won 50.8% of the vote, just enough to avoid a runoff, while opposition MDC leader Nelson Chamisa won 44%. Because of this, Nelson Chamisa refused to accept the results of the election and held a parallel presidential inauguration ceremony. As for economic reform, Mnangagwa failed in this too. In response to shortages of fuel, the government raised the price of fuel by 150% in one day. This led to a wave of protests, which were again met with violence, with 17 killed, 586 tortured, and thousands arrested. Today, Zimbabwe is facing 700% inflation, a return to the hyperinflation that existed in 2008. But to understand the current crisis, we have to understand the origins of this economic depression. Zimbabwe was not always like this, and in fact used to be one of the best developed nations in Africa. Robert Mugabe came to power in 1980 when Zimbabwe gained independence from British colonial rule. Mugabe had been one of the key leaders in the liberation struggle, and in the 1980s, many progressive policies were implemented. Massive investments were made in education and healthcare, such that Zimbabwe achieved within a few years a 92% literacy rate, the highest in all of Africa. Infant mortality was cut in half, and life expectancy went up. There was also reconciliation between white and black Zimbabweans. But things were not so rosy beneath the surface. Zimbabwe had inherited a deep inequality that was the result of colonial injustice and would form the spark for the crisis to come. You see, Zimbabwe had experienced a system similar to apartheid, with racial segregation and political domination by the white minority.
I don't believe in black majority rule ever in Rhodesia. Not in 1,000 years.
But even after independence, the economy was still dominated by whites. But the biggest inequality was in land. Around 5,000 white farmers controlled 15.5 million hectares of land. That's an area of land greater than the size of England. And it included 70% of the best land in the country, keeping in mind that white Zimbabweans were less than 2% of the population. Meanwhile, 780,000 black farming households were crowded onto 16.1 million hectares of land. This inequality had to be resolved through some form of land redistribution. But as one of the conditions for Zimbabwe's independence, Zimbabwe was not allowed to redistribute any land for 10 years, except under the willing buyer, willing seller principle. In exchange, Great Britain would help to finance the purchase of white-owned land. And in this period, some 1.6 million hectares of land was redistributed to 35,000 families. And while this policy was very successful for those people, it was far from enough. At the same time, Mugabe took the opportunity to consolidate his power. Mugabe's main rival was Joshua Nkomo, who was also involved in the liberation struggle and whose party, ZAPU, had most of its support in the Matabeleland region. In response to genuine dissidents in that region, Mugabe sent the North Korean-trained 5th Brigade to clamp down on the people there and intimidate them into supporting him, resulting in thousands of people being tortured or killed. To stop the bleeding, Joshua Nkomo agreed to merge his party with Mugabe's ZANU to create ZANU-PF, turning Zimbabwe into a de facto one-party state, with Mugabe winning upwards of 80% of the vote in every election. By the 1990s, corruption began to infect the country and economic growth slowed down, and so the government was forced to take loans from the IMF. As a condition for these loans, the government had to implement neoliberal economic policies. This entailed opening up to foreign competition and implementing austerity measures to cut government spending. The result was that Zimbabwean manufacturing suffered from cheaper Asian competition, while cutting education and healthcare budgets reversed some of the gains made in the 1980s, and removing food subsidies led to rising food prices. All these policies led to political discontent, but with no serious opposition party to turn to, people expressed their discontent through civil society. The trade unions began mobilizing, and in the year 1997 alone, there were over 237 strikes. People, especially in the cities, were fed up with the economic situation, fed up with corruption, and fed up with Mugabe, and so called for the creation of a new constitution. And by 1999, a new political party was formed, the Movement for Democratic Change, or MDC, led by Morgan Tsvangirai. At the same time, in the rural areas, people were still waiting for the land reform that they were promised, and so in 1997, the war veterans, a core part of Mugabe's base, began protesting against him and demanded their war veterans' pensions and immediate land redistribution. They even temporarily occupied several white-owned farms. Mugabe caved and gave them massive pension packages, which were totally unbudgeted for. That, and a costly foreign war in the Congo, led the Zimbabwe dollar to lose 75% of its value in one day in 1997. Because of impatience with land reform and growing political opposition, Mugabe tried to secure money for land reform from the British. But Prime Minister Tony Blair refused and claimed that the British had no colonial responsibility to Zimbabwe. And this action brought Zimbabwe into problems. Mugabe now had a volatile political situation. A core part of his political base was demanding land reform, but he had no money to do it. And so in response, he proposed a new constitution which would allow the government to seize white-owned land without compensation, as well as giving government officials immunity from prosecution and allowing Mugabe to stay in power longer. And so in the year 2000, a referendum on this new constitution was held, and Zimbabweans voted no by 55%, a rejection of Mugabe. But at the same time, the war veterans realized that land reform was not going to happen, and so they began occupying white-owned farms. That same year, the newly formed MDC won 47% of the vote in the elections, almost defeating Mugabe despite massive voter intimidation. Mugabe realized his time was running out, and so he had just one card left to play. And so in 2000, he gave the green light for people to simply occupy white-owned farms and take back the land by force.
This is Zimbabwe. It cannot be an extension of Britain.
Although much of the country's food was produced by small farmers, white commercial farms produced most of the country's cash crops, which were critical for export earnings. The new farmers did not have the expertise or the money to maintain production levels, and cash crops like tobacco did not recover for over 10 years. And so the economy went into freefall. This was exacerbated by the sanctions which the West then imposed on Zimbabwe. Now, these sanctions were only targeted at the leadership, not at the country as a whole, but they still had the effect of drying up all foreign investment. The inflation, which had already started in 1997, became worse and turned into hyperinflation. Zimbabwe's great social services collapsed. Mugabe blamed the collapse on Western imperialism and white Zimbabweans, and framed the MDC as lackeys of white farmers and British imperialists. Every election was rigged and opposition activists were tortured. But that didn't stop people from voting for MDC, and in the 2008 election, it looked like MDC had won such an overwhelming victory that even rigging couldn't stop it. Mugabe refused to release the election results for a month and accidentally let slip that the MDC may have won 70% of the vote.
When Tsvangirai got 73%.
When the rigged results finally came out, it showed that MDC had won. but only with 48% compared to Mugabe's 43%, and so there had to be a runoff election. In the lead up to the runoff, there was so much violence against MDC supporters that Morgan Tsvangirai dropped out of the race to stop the bloodshed, and so Mugabe won. But by this time, the country was in chaos. A loaf of bread cost $25 trillion. Every Zimbabwean was a starving billionaire. 3 million Zimbabweans out of 12 million total had left the country, and soldiers who hadn't been paid were looting shops. Mugabe's regime was about to collapse. But then, South Africa intervened. South African President Thabo Mbeki organized talks between Mugabe's ZANU-PF and the opposition MDC, and so a government of national unity was formed, with Morgan Tsvangirai as Prime Minister and Mugabe still as President. This coalition government abandoned the worthless Zimbabwe dollar and introduced the US dollar and South African rand as currency, and the economy somewhat stabilized. But the MDC also became complacent and started enjoying the fruits of power, and Parliament even voted to give itself massive salary increases. Mugabe bided his time and made sure that he could blame the problems on the MDC. And so a combination of MDC's declining popularity and some vote rigging ensured that in the next election in 2013, Mugabe won. And now with a weak opposition and Mugabe and ZANU-PF firmly back in power, infighting began within the ZANU-PF party. And it was when Mugabe sidelined Mnangagwa in order to promote his wife to the vice presidency that the military intervened in a coup. And the rest is history. With the economy still largely in shambles and essentially the same people from the last 40 years still in power, it seems that in Zimbabwe, power matters more than people's lives. Now, as some of you may know, this topic has some personal resonance for me, as I was born in Zimbabwe, but have not grown up there precisely because of this economic and political crisis. For this reason, I ask that you not only share this video, but sign the petition to stop police brutality in Zimbabwe, link in the description. And say this with me, say it loud, and say it proud. Zimbabwean lives matter. To learn about the ethnic tensions that are destabilizing Ethiopia, check out my last video. Thank you to my Patreons for making this video possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.